All right, good day everybody and welcome to today's Tech Talk. Today we're going to be talking about authentication for your applications and getting started with Amazon Cognito. My name is Quentin Van Diemen and I'm the Business Development Manager for our Identity and Directory Services here at AWS. So I'd like to start our talk today by giving you a little bit of a mental picture for perhaps how the next great application might get started. And we've got the aspiring app creator there on the left, and he's talking to a nice supportive friend of his. And he's got a great new idea for a cool new app. Hey, that's awesome, man. What are some of the cool new features? Users are going to be able to register and sign in. And obviously that wouldn't be what that aspiring app creator would want to talk about, right? He'd want to talk about something really unique and novel and what was going to send his new app, into the Hall of Fame of awesome applications. And that's what, when folks set out to build an application, that's what they're excited about. It is meaningful user features, not user identity. So user identity within an application isn't particularly interesting. It also happens to be particularly difficult in many instances. Right? There's a lot of infrastructure that needs to be built in terms of storing all the user information and their identities and credentials. There's a lot of sensitive information in that as well, right? Passwords and so on and so forth. And certainly in this day and age of very privacy aware, we got to make sure we really safeguard those sorts of details. Certainly identity has this kind of notion of being a tier 0 part of your application, right? If nobody can log in, it doesn't really matter what else might be there. And the whole just world of identity with federation and protocols like OpenID Connect and SAML and token-based auth. It's a little bit of black magic. And again, at the end of the day, it's necessary stuff to make a modern application work, but that's very much undifferentiated heavy lifting. And that's where we really see Amazon Cognito coming in and coming to the rescue. Right? And we're going to go through a lot today. We're going to unpack a lot about what Amazon Cognito is, but at the highest level, it essentially is our service that lets developers focus on what is special about their application and lets Cognito, a managed service from AWS, handle all of that authentication and identity. All right, so now before we drill into some of the kind of key features and the, how they apply in your application, I want to just quickly level set on some of the terms, some of the kind of underlying protocols and standards that are at play here, because it'll help our dialogue as we go forward. And first, almost a bit of a kind of maybe a quick history lesson, but let's kind of explore how we got to the world of a standard like OAuth 2, for example. And for those of you that have been in the internet age for a while now, right, we might be dating ourselves, but you might remember pages that look something like this. This is an actual website. I've kind of changed the name to protect the guilty, but you would go to a website like this, and if you wanted to collaborate with your friends on a given website, they often would ask you directly for your credentials. And this presented a whole host of problems, both for you as the user and for the website, right? It was just generally a very bad model. You had to really trust that they were going to actually delete your email password. They had to impersonate you and to the outbound services, just really not a good thing. And that essentially is why OAuth and OAuth 2 were originally created. They are essentially a means to provide secure delegated access so that you can give rights to your data on one service through another. Right? And the way it all gets implemented at the end of the day is that OAuth enables services access, whether they're coming from devices, APIs, or applications, they access those backend services with tokens rather than credentials like a username and password. And that's going to be, it'll be obvious how that comes together as we move on. So again, OAuth was this broad standard that's been around for a while now that is all about kind of authorization between various parties. Now, OpenID Connect, which is probably a term you've also heard these days, came later and layered in on top of that. So if OAuth 2 is a broad specification for authorization, OpenID Connect, or OIDC, is a very detailed specification for identity that kind of rides on top of OAuth 2. It inherits and uses everything that OAuth 2 is good for, but it just layered in the notion of identity on top of it. Whereas again, OAuth 2 was kind of broad and left a lot of the implementation up to the folks that were doing it. OIDC is very opinionated. Right? There are standardized sets of tokens, right? ID tokens, access tokens, refresh tokens, and there are standardized attributes and claims that are necessary and go within those tokens. It standardized some of the flows, right? And a flow is kind of the flow of interaction between the different parties, between the end user, the identity provider, and the relying party. And we'll kind of talk about what those terms are all in a second, right? So, but how does this work in practice, right? And so I always find that just kind of simple pictures are good at kind of level setting things. Again, this isn't going to be a full history or a full education on OpenID Connect, just enough for us to have a good conversation today. So when we want to do OpenID Connect federation between two parties, we've got on one hand the OpenID provider, right? This is the identity provider, the system that actually is responsible for authenticating the user. And then we've got the relying party. We've got essentially the service that wants to consume data on behalf of the user. And now these two get together ahead of time. The OpenID Connect provider provides some metadata that talks about known endpoints for their various services and things of that nature. And the relying party will generally register with the OpenID provider, getting a client secret and a client ID and client secret that it uses to identify itself. And then at runtime, when the user comes about, all of the authentication happens up to the identity provider, right? And the identity provider is also going to ask the user basic questions. Let's say, the relying party here on the right wants to use your data XYZ. Do you authorize them to do so? Assuming you do, and the flow, your authentication obviously was completed successfully, the OpenID provider returns back to that relying party as a set of tokens, right? And again, we talked about it a second ago, normally ID, access, and refresh tokens. So now let's look at what one of these JWT or Java Web Tokens looks like under the hood, right? And so it's an encoded, base64 encoded JSON token that is just simply key value pairs, right? And it's got three basic stanzas to it. The first stanza is known, and they're delineated by these periods that you may be able to call out in the slide. The first stanza is the header, right? And the header mainly just identifies the key ID and the encryption algorithm that are going to be used to eventually sign the JWT, right? And that just gives us, that lets us look up information about how we're going to verify the token. The next is the payload, right? And this is primarily the meaty part of the token that we're going to be most interested in. But this is where the identity provider has encoded information that it knows about the user, things like their email address or their name or even their birth date. It's going to encode that information in the form of these key value pairs within JSON. And then finally, the signature, right? And this is where the identity provider is going to take that payload. It's going to sign that payload using the key that was specified in the initial header, and it's going to attach that signature as the third stanza of the JWT. And this is essentially by verifying that signature, you, the recipient of the JWT, know that the payload came from the identity provider and hasn't been altered. Right? So you put it all together, and those three stanzas make up the JWT. Okay, so again, that was just a super fast flyby on some kind of core concepts that we'll kind of be touching on quite a bit as we go through things today. So now let's turn to to Amazon Cognito. And first, I want to give you kind of a deeper dive on some of the key features that it enables for your application. But before I do, Cognito is essentially very much a Swiss Army knife of a toolkit for your app. But there are two major portions, right? And I find that it's just kind of helpful to orient you to these two halves of Cognito early, so that as we go through things, it'll kind of make sense where everything falls. So the first half of the functionality of Cognito is delivered through Cognito user pools. And today, that is honestly the majority of where you're going to interact with Cognito. And then the second half of Cognito is known as identity pools. Now that name goes back a way. It's if we had it to all overdo it, or if we had to do it all over again, we probably wouldn't choose that exact name of Cognito identity pools, but it is what it is. So Cognito user pools and Cognito identity pools. And I've drawn that line there to kind of both delineate where the breakpoint is, but you'll notice that federation is kind of right in the middle. And that is, we'll talk about this a little bit later on, that is because there actually are two ways to bring in federated identities within Cognito. You can either do it in the user pool, which is probably more normal today, or you can also bring them through the identity pool. But we'll discuss that as we get into things. So now let's look at some of the, there's many features of Amazon Cognito, but let's really kind of drill in on some of the key ones. So we're going to double click on each of these, but just to kind of give the rough framing. First, right, it is essentially a fully managed user directory that can scale to hundreds of millions of users that is fully managed on your behalf, or by AWS on your behalf in the cloud, right? Secure, low cost, and tremendously high scale. The second is that it's got kind of a built-in user interface, right, for things like sign up, sign in, password resets. It's a component that you can drop into your application such that you don't have to code all of the UI that is associated with its normal user flows if you don't wish to. Third is that like we talked about, OAuth 2 is an important standard for how kind of modern web applications come together, how they share information, and there's great support for OAuth 2 within Cognito. And finally, again, if you think about a lot of modern apps that you're using these days, whether if it's a consumer-facing application, more often than not, app developers want to be able to offer social login choices like sign in with Google, sign in with Facebook, log in with Amazon. If it's a corporate-facing or employee-facing application, you might want to log in with SAML, or even OpenID Connect is perhaps coming on more these days within the enterprise. But all of those protocols require a lot of kind of black magic, if you will, and Cognito kind of abstracts that away and handles a lot of that complexity of those federated protocols for you. So let's dive in and look at each one of these individually in a little bit more depth. All right, so let's go ahead and double click into each one of these. And the first, as mentioned, is our managed user directory. Right? And so if you can imagine thinking about how you might build this sort of system for your own systems, or the way you would have done this previously, is you'd probably have LDAP servers that were up in the cloud. You'd have to manage a lot of replication. You'd have to patch them. You'd have to tune LDAP queries, all those sorts of things. And with obviously with the serverless directory, right, we've taken that all off your hands. AWS takes care of all of that management and operations for you, and essentially just allows you to interoperate with the directory using familiar APIs. You also, again, as a managed service, it takes care of all of the redundancy for you using the multi-AZ patterns that you're probably very familiar with. Now, within that directory, we're going to store all the sorts of user and group information that you would probably expect, right? There's the profile information, things like the name, email address, and so forth. There's the credential and device information, such as MFA. What's particularly neat, though, about the implementation of the directory with Cognito is that instead of actually storing very sensitive information like passwords, we simply store what are known as secure remote password, or SRP verifiers. And this is a kind of a fancy cryptographic technique that allows Cognito to store essentially an ability to verify that the password was correct without storing the actual password itself. And then finally, you're able to essentially extend the default scheme as the default set of attributes that we've populated that make sense for most applications, with any number of custom attributes that kind of make sense for you. Okay, so next, let's take a look at the hosted user interface, right? So we've got this hosted UI, again, as a component that you can essentially drop into your application and meld it seamlessly into the background with customizable logos, customizable styling and branding. You can see kind of by some of the examples there that you can alter the layout. And it essentially is there to facilitate a lot of the common user flows, right? So sign up. So when folks want to register a new account for your site, when they want to sign in, when they want to sign in with one of their social accounts or corporate accounts, right? It handles all of the or forgot password. It handles all these flows for you on your behalf, right? So you don't have to worry about kind of building that part of the UI. You can either use it with your, by default, there's a simple Cognito domain that lets you get going and start it up quickly. But if you really want to just absolutely, have this thing meld seamlessly into the background of your application so that no one even knows it's Cognito under the hood, you can actually even use your own domain with it as well. All right, third, let's look at some of the OAuth 2 support in user pools. Again, this kind of goes hand in hand a bit with that hosted UI, but Cognito supports 4 main OAuth 2 flows. Now, the way you choose your flow that's appropriate for you is kind of dependent on the type of application you're building. If you're building a JavaScript single-page application, you might use something like the implicit flow. If you're building a web app where you've got a little bit more of a trusted backend, server-side backend, you're probably going to do more of the authorization code. There's lots of great resources out there, either within the Cognito documentation or just the internet at large, that kind of help you choose the right flow for you. But Cognito supports these 4 flows. And again, kind of they go hand in hand with that hosted UI. And then the second part of the OAuth 2 support within Cognito user pools is the way and we talked about in the intro within OAuth 2, the notion of secure delegation. Well, the way a delegation is generally defined within OAuth 2 is by using what's known as a scope. And a scope is simply just a bundle of information that you, the user, are authorizing the remote site for. And some of them are very standardized, like OpenID or profile or email, that contain a set of attributes. But within Cognito, you can also define your own custom scopes for your own custom resource servers. And that plays, that comes into play as we'll talk later on about how you do authorization for your downstream APIs. Okay, so the fourth one that we want to kind of double click on is this notion of identity federation. Right, and if it wasn't obvious to this point, actually Amazon Cognito can store either what we would generally refer to as native identities, so where someone is registering on your or through your application as a username and password, or they can kind of federate in using, again, social providers or corporate providers. And the two can actually exist in parallel. We'll see that, you saw that on a couple of the hosted UI screenshots a second ago, and we'll see that later on in the demo. But when the main part that Amazon Cognito provides you, well, there's kind of two things it does for you in this world of federation. One is it handles, the world of SAML and OpenID Connect are full of redirects and postbacks and a lot of kind of complicated exchanges that kind of boomerang through the browser, and it's going to manage those all for you. But then the second thing it does is it kind of normalizes all of those identities into the standard user profile that's defined in the user pool. And then out of that standard profile, it issues its own tokens back to the application. And kind of the so what here is that means that no matter whether you're using any of the identity types, be it SAML, be it OpenID Connect, or being native, all of those essentially get normalized into one standard set of tokens, and that's all that your application needs to know how to consume. So your application can actually be completely abstracted away from the nuances of these various different types of federated identities. Your application only needs to know how to operate with a standard set of JWTs that come out of Cognito. Now, again, we're not going to worry about kind of the detailed flows of SAML here too much, but just to give you an idea of the sorts of complexity that Cognito is essentially masking on your behalf, this is something of the kind of the standard service provider initiated flow within SAML. So you got the user, they started a browser, right? They're going to pop in, they're probably going to provide an email address. The service generally has to look up, if you were building a B2B app, there might be lots of different domains that could be relevant there. So we've got to discover the identity provider that's right for this particular user. We've got to generate what's known as a SAML auth-in request that gets forwarded back to the browser and ultimately redirects the user to their proper identity provider to authenticate, be that with something like Shibboleth or Active Directory Federation services. The user goes through the authentication process and then gets this SAML response that again gets ultimately posted back to Cognito. And in the world of this abstraction where Cognito handles all of this for you, essentially this all becomes irrelevant to you. We'll see in the demo that you've got to provide just the very basics about the metadata that help establish the identity providers that you want to trust. But after that, Cognito takes care of all of that process for you. Okay, now we've talked a bit at this point about a lot of the features that are some of the features that Cognito supports. But when we're really talking about applications, what almost matters more than that are the notion of user flows, right? And I've talked about a lot of these, so I'm not going to go through each and every one that's here, right? But these are essentially the flows of user functionality that Cognito can essentially take care of for you so that you don't have to build it within your application, right? So obviously sign up and sign in are kind of the most core and the most primitive, right? We've talked about others about, forgetting your password. Ones that we haven't looked at thus far are the notion of, doing verifications of either an email address or a phone number, which is very relevant to in terms of protecting against fraud. We've got things like being able to, let the user self-service and view and update their profile data. And then finally, looking at things about multi-factor, right? When we want to have a stronger sign-in experience than just a username and password, Cognito will facilitate that multi-step authentication process. But we also realize that, not all of these flows are always one size fits all. Many folks want to be able to customize those flows to meet the very specific needs of their application. And Cognito essentially provides a variety of lambda-based, which is our function as a service, service within AWS. So it provides a number of these lambda hooks to essentially let you customize these various flows, right? So if you wanted to do a completely custom authentication flow, passwordless is kind of very much a hot topic right now within this general space. Or if you wanted to insert captchas, or if you wanted to do any sort of custom authentication flow that might be contextual to things that are outside the normal scope of Cognito auth flows, you can actually build an entirely custom auth flow using these lambda hooks. Okay. Similarly for authentication events, right? If you want to either ahead of the authentication, if you want to do some particularly unique validation about, what you know about the user or where they are or the device they're signing in from. On the backside of authentication, you might want to do some analytics. You might want to reach out to some other systems within your broader ecosystem to embed other attributes that maybe even Cognito doesn't know about into the identity tokens, right? You can do lots of different customization here. There are other further categories. Again, I won't read through each and every one of them, but around how you can customize the sign-up process and various messages that occur within the various flows. Okay, now the complement to the kind of user flows is obviously the other persona that you've normally got in an application are the administrators. And Cognito also offers a broad set of capabilities for the administrators of your application, right? Probably, so that there are going to be standard things that you would expect, like setting up password policies, being able to search and manage users, administrative actions on those users, like administrator-based password resets, right, or confirmations, and then just managing Cognito itself, right? You can create any number of user pools, define those custom attributes that we talked about, and so on and so forth. So kind of a broad range of administrative capabilities that help you manage the users that are within your pool. Okay, so if that is, at least at a quick level, kind of a decent snapshot of some of the core features of Cognito, now let's talk about how you can go about integrating Cognito with your application. And so a couple of choices here. Option one is AWS Amplify. And this is going to be particularly well suited if you're building a mobile app or a JavaScript-based web application. Because Amplify essentially these days is the unified AWS SDK of choice for building applications that fall into those patterns. It has three main kind of components to it. One is that it's, as mentioned, a kind of a comprehensive library for building cloud-powered apps. One of those modules within that library is authentication, and that's obviously powered by Cognito. But it has lots of other, really helpful modules as well for storage or accessing your APIs or analytics and so on and so forth. So it's kind of a great drop-in toolkit that really takes a lot of heavy lifting out of the effort of building an application. It's also got, kind of a tool chain that helps you, kind of manage the life cycle of an application, deployments and so on and so forth. And then it has its own, kind of styled UI components for various file choosers and, lots of different kind of common UI components that you might expect, right? And so, again, if you're building a mobile app, if you're building a JavaScript-based web app, it's probably your go-to choice. And you can find it. I've got the link there on the screen, but it's produced and deployed as an open source project that AWS sponsors. All right. The second option for how you can integrate your app or Cognito with your application is the one we're going to see in the demo today, but that's using the hosted UI and OAuth flows. So we talked about kind of choosing the OAuth flow that's right for you based on your application type. But once you do so, really all that's necessary to integrate the basic portions of Cognito are just to construct the necessary HTTP headers and execute the necessary request flow, right? That kind of goes hand in hand with that OAuth flow that you've chosen. The real benefits here are it's very language agnostic, right? It's very lightweight. You just have to formulate some HTTP requests and post those to the Cognito endpoint. And that makes it very well suited for all sorts of web-based apps, but probably ones that particularly that are non-JavaScript based. Again, because in that JavaScript case, you'd probably want to go with Amplify. And then finally, the third option, and this can kind of be used in concert, honestly, with either of the first two, but you can just directly integrate with the Cognito APIs. So you would take the AWS SDK of your choice, whether that's Bodo for Python or any of the SDKs that we have, or any of the languages that we have an SDK option for, and you would simply write directly to the Cognito APIs. So you might, for a signing experience, you might do the initiate auth API call, and so on and so forth. Similar for allowing access into the profile information, you're just going to make raw Cognito API calls. The big advantage here is that it allows you to provide, or it gives you the ability to have complete control over the user experience and flows. Since you're not using the hosted UI, the UI is just another part of your application that you build to your own specifications, and you're just using Cognito in the back end, right, as kind of that managed user directory, authentication, and so forth. And as I mentioned, the why you would choose this option is it just provides kind of the maximum flexibility. Okay, so now I wanted to, before we get to the demo, I want to touch on just a couple of other quick features. Won't go into these in as much depth in the spirit of time, but they're, I think, relevant to touch on at least at a high level. So the first are your MFA options, right? And so this applies to when you're doing native identities within the user pool, when folks are actually signing up with a username and password. And Cognito today supports two different types of MFA options. You can either do text message based with SMS, or you can do one-time password, using common applications like Google Authenticator, for example. There's lots of apps these days that support kind of the TOTP standard. The second is, and this kind of almost like a category of features, but we've got a bundle that are called the advanced security features. And the highest, there's some really interesting stuff in here that Cognito is doing about kind of scanning the dark, scary corners of the internet for things like compromised credentials, and providing you, both the user and you, the operator of the application, some insight into where those have been detected and how you want to handle them. And then, kind of complement to that, it provides some really neat capabilities around adaptive authentication. So Cognito is going to calculate a risk score for every login attempt, and you can set rules about various thresholds where maybe if it's a low-risk authentication, you'll just let them in with a username and password. But if it's a higher risk event, you might want to challenge for that MFA. Right? And kind of the third portion of these advanced security features is just some extra and more robust security reporting and insights. And then, what I think is a really compelling story is, the birth of some of these advanced security features really harks back to a genesis of where this is Amazon taking its years and years and years of identity experience with operating large sites like Amazon.com and codifying those types of features and making them consumable to you as an app developer. And I always think that's a very compelling story. And then last, I want to just quickly touch on that we've got, many times when folks are implementing Cognito, they might be doing so for an existing application rather than a new application. And so we've got to have some options for migrating an existing user base. And Cognito provides you two options in this space. One is you can kind of do a one-time CSV style import, or you can do kind of just in time. The real decision point between the two are the batch style operations will require the users to choose a new password. For obvious reasons, we're not going to, we don't want spreadsheets flying around your environment or anywhere else that have a whole, have tons of user credentials in it. And so just erring on the side of caution, the batch import capabilities do not support importing a password. Whereas the just-in-time methods, which really are real-time, that it's implemented by one of those custom lambda hooks, we can do a lot stronger security around kind of how we broker that process, and you can actually migrate the users in using their same password, their same credential, using that just-in-time option. Okay, so last thing before we flip over and we look at the demo, let's just kind of quickly walk through how kind of this all comes together between your application and Cognito. And so if we've got kind of Cognito, or your mobile app in the middle there, and I've drawn it as a mobile, but it could certainly be a web app as well, right? The first step that you're going to do once you've kind of gotten to the authenticated portion of your application is you're going to generate that authentication request up to the Amazon Cognito user pool. If you've chosen to use federation, again, Cognito is going to handle all those redirects out to the appropriate identity provider, receive all the postbacks, so on and so forth. But it's going to receive that identity provider token back into the user pool. But now instead of returning it to the application, which would mean the application would have to understand that ID token, it's going to instead return a normalized set of Cognito user pool, or CUP token, right? And this, again, is a standard JWT. And so regardless of whether your users were native users or any of those different federated types, everybody gets normalized into one standard set of CUP tokens. And then from there, you can use those directly within the application for authentication if you want to display their name or their username in a UI, or you want to use their identities for some very coarse-grained authorizations about hiding tabs or showing tabs, right? Role-based type stuff. You could certainly do that. But then, what's probably more prevalent is you're going to use these CUP tokens that have been provided by Cognito to do OAuth authentication authorization back to the APIs that you might build, right? And we'll talk about some of kind of the neat integrations between Cognito and some of the adjacent services. But if you're building server APIs with things like API Gateway or ALB, you can simply just pass that CUP token within an authorization header, and AWS has some neat and simple, just push button type configurations that allow you to easily add authentication and authorization to those backend APIs. But now, if you need to access services where you need not, kind of a user pool token, but you need AWS credentials, the other half of Cognito that we haven't talked about as much today, that identity pool, right? You can actually take your Cognito user pool token, deliver that down to the identity pool, and get back what's known as an STS token, or Security Token Service Token. And this is a standard AWS credential that's used to essentially access any of the AWS APIs, right? So if your app needs to contact services like DynamoDB or S3 on the user's behalf, you can use that STS token as a means for accessing those. So the way I'd have you think about it is the CUP token are for APIs that you build, and the STS token are for APIs that AWS builds. And that's kind of how the whole ecosystem comes together. So now, as I mentioned, right, one of Cognito has, I think, a great set of compelling features in its own right, but it certainly is also well bolstered by the fact that there's it fits within this ecosystem of these adjacent services and has some really nice and clean touch points that help you kind of weave the entire story of authorization. So I highlighted the API gateway one a second ago, where we simply take the Cognito tokens issued by the user pool, and we can actually use those to authenticate and authorize the user to a backend API, right? And we'll see how, again, that works in even further detail in the demo. But if you're building your APIs or your backend services with load balancers, or even putting an ALB in front of your entire application, you can actually just kind of do checkbox type configurations within ALB, pointed at your user pool, and then any user coming into that application will be challenged as necessary to authenticate with Cognito. Cognito returns back, that standard set of Cognito tokens back to the ALB, back to the application, and then you can continue on. And then, as we saw kind of in that previous slide, right, if you need to access in a number of AWS services, Dynamo, S3, SNS, SQS, think about all the various services that are really applicable for that provide functionality for building applications. Cognito essentially is your means of retrieving the appropriate types of AWS credentials that are necessary for accessing those services. And all of this is again, kind of part of the package that's pre-built for you when you adopt Cognito. Okay, so let's flip over quickly, and I'm going to do a quick demonstration. It is always a little bit difficult to make demonstrations of logging into things particularly compelling, but we're going to do our best here, right? And so this is a simple little app that I built actually for a reInvent demonstration last year. So forgive the kind of outdated name in the slide there, right? But this is just a Flask, a Python Flask web app running in some containers with an API gateway hosted backend that kind of facilitates some of these demos, right? And so the first step here, right, if I just want to go to one of my flows, Cognito is going to detect that I'm not logged in, right? And it's going to present me what you're looking at here is, again, that hosted UI that we talked about. For this application, have configured that either I could log in natively with a username and password and sign up as relevant, or as this is, or in this case, I've also enabled a SAML federation provider. And I'm going to choose that option here. You can see that Cognito essentially forwarded me, the user, with no application, development, components necessary over to the identity provider, and is asking me to log into my identity provider. So after I authenticate, Cognito essentially managed all of the postback, all the consuming of the SAML assertion, and then essentially just delivered me back to the application. And again, it's probably subtle. It looks like nothing's really going on there, but the complexity that Cognito is kind of taking off your plate is really quite significant. You'll see now that that my application is essentially using the identity that's provided back to Cognito to do some basic personalization. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to simply call a backend API. And this API is not particularly interesting. It essentially just it takes the identity token that you provide as the authorization and just unpacks it and shows the various claims that come in that token, right? So you can see things like my username, you can see things like my fictitious email address, you can see how this user was authenticated, and so on and so forth. And again, not the most terribly complex API, but the real point here being, and we'll see this as we jump into the AWS console, is that that API was essentially authenticated and authorized using the ID token that this application passed down to the API. Okay, so now if we kind of work backwards from there, if that was the end user experience, now let's look at how I, the application developer, essentially integrated Cognito with this app. Right? And so in this very basic mode, I really only needed to define two basic functions. The first was a login, right, that I just specified to handle that given URL path. And really all I need to do here, I'm going to be doing the authorization code grant flow. And so I need to know the login endpoint that's a standard OAuth 2 endpoint for Cognito that is specific to the domain name I've chosen and the region I'm operating in. And I just construct that the necessary URL, which kind of has that information, plus a client ID, the scopes, being open ID and the profile that I've asked for, and ultimately the redirect URI. A lot of these other variables are coming from parameter store, which I've kind of not shown here, but At the end of the day, really all you need to do is formulate this URL and submit it. The rest of everything happens within that hosted UI. But when I get the callback from Cognito, it's simply, assuming it's all been successful, I'm going to get an authorization code. And this is, again, the second half or the second leg of the authorization code grant flow. I'm just going to take my client ID and my client secret. I'm going to return that authorization code to, in this case, the token endpoint. Instead of up here, you can see I was using the authorized endpoint. So I return that authorization code to the token endpoint. And what I'm going to get back is essentially, from the response, I'm just going to get, the only two that I've saved here are the ID and access tokens, right? And I can store those in my session and go about what's necessary. So then once I have that in play, if I go look at this who am I function that I was demonstrating, all I really need to do is take and construct an authorization header that just prefixes the word bearer, as is the convention, into a header known as authorization, and I simply submit that header in my API request when I'm calling the who am I API, and that's all there is to it, right? No other, and this is pretty standard bearer token authorization, but no other complexity required, right? So that's kind of the application side. So now let's quickly look at kind of the Cognito and API gateway sides. So I'm kind of just going deeper into the stack here, right? So now let's look at the Cognito user pool. So again, there's pretty guided flow that'll help you set up the user pool. But just to highlight a couple of things, if this is down here within identity providers, it provides a fairly managed and simple way to configure these external identity providers that you want to support. In this case, I supported a single SAML provider, but if I wanted to turn on any of these others, I would just go through a fairly managed flow there. As we talked about within kind of the introduction, when you're building an OAuth as kind of enabled application, part of the deal is the application needs to register with the identity provider. So that's known as an app client, right? And here you can see I've registered with my user pool. I've kind of said that I want to support Shibboleth and my native users, right? That's why you saw those two options relevant in the hosted UI. And then you can see the OAuth flows that I want to support based on the type of application I know this to be, the scopes, and so on and so forth, right? And then the last thing that I'll kind of call out in the user pool portion of things is that, again, here you can see kind of this composite user pool, right? If I'm looking at the users and groups, you can see I've got one user here that's kind of a native user. This is a user with a username and a password and an MFA in my actual user pool. And then you can see these external users, right, that I've come in and I've been authenticated. This string is kind of intentionally opaque, but it is consistent, right? So you can consistently recognize the same user back without having kind of that information leakage about who they were, right? At least at this level. All of their uniquely identifying attributes are present within the tokens in a way that you can view them. And then lastly, I'll just kind of quickly switch over and look at kind of the API gateway side of things. So you can get a little sense for, how I can, once I had that Cognito user pool configured, how I added support for that to my API. So I built this API with what's known as the Chalice framework within Python. If you've not built an API before, I'd highly suggest it. It makes it really, really easy. But to add Cognito authorization and authentication to my API, I really only need to come here and I need to do two things. First, I need to create a new authorizer. And really all I have to do is point it at the particular user pool I'm interested in, and then just specify the name of the header where that, and you'll recall that when we were looking at the code earlier, authorization was the name of the header that I put the token into. So I specify that there. And then under the actual API methods, if I go into this who am I, and I go into the get method, I can just see that as it comes up here, if we go into the method, I just can simply specify that I want to have Cognito be this user pool authorizer, be the appropriate authorization method. I can optionally provide some OAuth scopes, right? So if if I was doing either custom scopes or if I was doing the kind of the built-in scopes, I could specify those as further granular authorizations, right? But at the basic level, this will certainly just make sure that I'm providing valid tokens in that authorization header. Okay, so let's switch back over here. So hopefully that gave you a reasonable kind of first view of Cognito. I want to provide some further places for you to go explore and learn. The first one, the one there is on the left, is a serverless authentication authorization workshop that's out there hosted in GitHub that a number of our serverless solution architects have put together. And it's got a really great Cognito module in it around that helps you go build a basic app, pulls down predefined source code and helps you kind of glue in the authentication authorization specific pieces using Amplify, using Cognito. So it's a real hands-on kind of thing, probably 45 minutes to an hour and you'll be up and running. But really, I would highly, highly suggest it's a great place to kick the tires. And not only will that give you kind of a great hands-on experience of some of the things I've shown you today, but you can also use that as kind of the springboard to explore either further into Amplify or further into kind of a lot of our different serverless patterns. And then the second one there is a reInvent session from last year around kind of this broader topic of serverless authentication and authorization. We've touched on it, fairly quickly today, but again, it's going to be using all the same types of techniques we've talked about how you do the front-end authentication in Cognito that generates the set of standardized tokens, and then you can use those standardized tokens across an array of back-end AWS services to kind of complete the full picture of a modern application. And so I really would highly encourage you to check out both of those as you move forward from here. And with that, I think we'll take a pause and we'll spend the rest of our time going into some Q&A.